Chapter 10 William and Margaret Ferguson and family. William Ferguson and Margaret Fraser were married in Auckland on October 19, 1865 at the house of Mr. Silas Nice. Robert Taylor and Jane Ferguson were the best man and bridesmaid. They lived in Wellesley Street for a short time. Their son Alexander was born there on July 23, 1866, before going to Poverty Bay to take up land at Makaraka, 4 miles west of Gisborne. Gisborne was actually called Turanga, or Turanganui, at the time. William Ferguson worked as a bootmaker, perhaps making other leather goods also as the local community required. Life in the area was relatively quiet when the Ferguson family arrived, either at the end of 1866 or early 1867, and continued so for the first year, during which time Catherine A.N. Ferguson was born on December 14, 1867. In the 2 years preceding their arrival at Poverty Bay, there had been an uprising by the Maori Hor forces which had been defeated. It resulted in the deportation in March 1866, without trial, of several Hor prisoners and their supposed supporters to the Chatham Islands. The latter group of these individuals included the chief Te Kuti Rikirangi. Despite the peacefulness, all able-bodied men were expected to belong to the self-defense forces, such as the Poverty Bay Military Reserve. Most probably William Fraser would have been a trooper in the latter group. All this preparedness proved necessary, because Te Kuti and his fellow deportees captured the government vessel Rifleman on June 4, 1868 and escaped to the mainland, a few miles south of Poverty Bay. Te Kuti and his band evaded various attempts to recapture them and they escaped into the hinterland. Incidentally, the Encyclopedia of New Zealand gives an interesting account of how Te Kuti got his name. Prior to being shipped to the Chathams, when in prison, he was so sure he could prove his innocence that he made several unsuccessful requests to be tried in court. He was so persistent that his fellow prisoners dubbed him Te Kuti, pronounced Korti. Tragedy followed his escape. In the early hours of the morning of November 10, 1868, Te Kuti and his followers attacked the settlers in Matafaro, next to Makaraka, and surrounding areas. The result was the death of 29 Europeans, 13 men, 7 women and 9 children, 4 half-casters and 30 friendly Maoris. This then was to become known as the Poverty Bay Massacre. A good deal has been written about this event. Perhaps the best account is provided by J. A. Macy in his book Historic Poverty Bay, where a reasonable objective assessment is given together with much specific detail, including the map which I have copied here. Interesting but less objective accounts are provided by James Hawthorne in his book A Dark Chapter from New Zealand History. The New Zealand Herald in its monthly summary of Wednesday, December 2, 1868, and by Thomas Gudgeon in his book The Defenders of New Zealand. I am not proposing to repeat the story of the 2 or 3 days of horror that followed. William and Margaret Ferguson lived in the center of Makaraka, perhaps only a few hundred meters from the man farm. It was the Mans who, Edith Cooper tells me, were lured outside by apparently friendly Maoris and killed. At the time William was 27, Margaret 23, Alec 2.5, and Catherine 11 months. In addition, Margaret was about 3 months pregnant. Alfred Ferguson was born May 22, 1869. The horror of the events and the frightening and breathless escape to the Turangarita would have hardened Margaret's resolve to return to the safety of Auckland, and to never go back to Makaraka. Apparently this is what must have happened, and she returned with the 2 children, while William had to stay on because he was required to fight with the military reserve. Edith Cooper tells me that in fact he was doing well there and was enjoying the area and would have liked to have stayed. Margaret obviously won, and probably as soon as he was able to leave he packed what little remained. Their home would have been burned down, and returned to Auckland. Alfred William was born in Wakefield Street on May 22, 1869. Archibald Fraser was around 1870, and Edith Fraser was born September 4, 1873. William was probably employed as a bootmaker at this time, perhaps working for Mr. T. Ellison in Queen Street. The family lived in West Street, Newton from about 1879 until after Margaret died in 1887. Irene would have been born there on April 12, 1880, and lastly Charles Fraser nearly 3 years later on January 4, 1883. The first of several tragedies, excluding the Makaraka event, that befell the family occurred on September 14, 1885, when Archie, who was working for Mr. Ellison on his farm at Tamaki, tried to ride a horse which he had been harrowing with, and fell off to be caught under the tines of the harrow. He died from the injuries. There was an unpleasantly detailed account of the incident in the New Zealand Herald on Wednesday, September 16, 1885. An even worse tragedy for the family was the death of Margaret from TB less than 2 years later on May 31, 1887 at West Street. The family must have moved to Mount Eden soon after that. It is possible that it was not just Margaret's death that caused the move but a decision to set up a shop of his own. Alfred was also a bootmaker and was presumably working with his father. This was not to be for very long, however, because although he must have been fit and strong as a fireman in the Auckland Fire Brigade, and was accorded a fire brigade funeral, he too contracted TB and died on July 6, 1897. Meanwhile, things seem to have changed for the family when William married again, marrying a widow Mariana Offer, née Bartlett, in 1889. Mariana apparently had 4 children of her own: Dolly, William, Jane and Lizzie. In addition, a daughter was born to William and Mariana in 1892, but she did not live for long. However, it would appear that the new stepmother did not get on too well with some of William's children. Alexander was away, perhaps even working for his uncle, father-in-law-to-be, Carl Hansen. Catherine married in July 1891, see next chapter. Alfred was unmarried but probably boarded at the time of his death, as he was in the household of one Mr. Molden and Newton. Edith Ferguson married in 1893, aged 18 or 19, perhaps in order to move away. Certainly Renee lived with Catherine and Tom when they were in Rotorua in 1893, and also afterwards with the Hansons, I am led to believe. There is a mixture of family oral history and speculation in this account, but it does seem to have been an unhappy period for the family. Perhaps because of internal family tension, William pursued his hobby of watercolor painting during this time. He produced some very competent watercolors rather reminiscent of J.C. Hoyt. I know of 2 of the paintings, one of Halleck Beach, owned by Edith Cooper, and one of Sandy Bay that Peter Aspden has in his possession, with this one dated 1895. Around 1895 the sisters Catherine and Edith went with their husbands, Tom Aspden and Arthur Clark, in partnership, to Matapree to develop a bush-covered block of government-granted land. This is described in greater detail in the next chapter. However, the sad fate of 2 members of the Ferguson family related to Matapree should be mentioned. The marriage between Edith Ferguson and Arthur Clark does not seem to have been a happy one, and Clark's treatment of his wife was apparently a contributing factor to her death 2 days after the birth of their son Arthur Ernest Clark Jr. This caused a break in the partnership, described in the next chapter. Clark stayed in Matapree for about another 2 years before returning to Auckland. He remarried around that time. His eventual end was just as tragic. The final tragedy was the accidental death of Charles Ferguson when he was working on the farm, felling and moving timber. He had his legs caught in a wire rope he was using to lower a large totara trunk down a steep slope. He died the same day on September 15, 1905. There is an account of the accident in the New Zealand Herald of Monday, September 18, 1905. William must have suffered greatly with all these losses, but was at least spared the sadness of the First World War, since he died on August 5, 1914 as war was declared by England on Germany. The three members of the family who survived him were Alec, Catherine and Renee. Alec Fraser married his first cousin Charlotte Hanson in February 1899 and worked as a painter and decorator. They lived first in Upper Simons Street and later in Ellerslie, which is where Alec Fraser died on August 15, 1945. Renee Fraser married Joseph Basildon in May 1902. They lived in Mount Albert. Renee died there in September 1968. It is interesting to note from Catherine's diaries how close Alec, Catherine and Renee were. They visited each other frequently and also met in town. It was a happy ending to a family so often touched by tragedy. Chapter 11. Tom and Catherine. I have already mentioned the period of youth of both Tom and Catherine. Tom would have gone to school only until he was 12, if even as long as that, and then worked for a period on his father's farm, possibly until the family left the Malku around 1884. Edith Cooper tells me that he worked in Auckland before going north in his early 20s to the Kaitaia area. He stayed there for some time making roads, building bridges and fencing before returning to Auckland. Catherine and Tom probably met because her Aunt Jemima was married to Tom's brother, James. Anyway, they were married on July 25, 1891 at the office of the Registrar of Marriages in Auckland. The witnesses to the signing of the certificate were James Aspden and Mary Rachel Walker. In a letter to me dated July 11, 1980, Edith Cooper describes the time after the wedding as follows. He tried to find suitable work, which was hard to get and poorly paid. They kept a food shop of some sort for a time, then went to Rotorua, where I was born on May 3, 1893. Things were no better there, so they went back to Auckland and ironed thereafter up to Matapori with all its joys and sorrows. A friend who was a surveyor helped make arrangements for the purchase of some crown land covered with bush, so that was the start of tree felling and all that followed, splitting fence posts, railway sleepers, etc., and from there on to something bigger. Tom could raise very little money, so entered into what proved to be an unhappy partnership with Arthur Clark. Both couples went up there together and lived in the rough shelter built by the two men who first had to split boards out of green trees in the bush. Edith Cooper's comment that it could not have been very comfortable would have to be an understatement. Particularly for the wives, life must have been very difficult. When they went to Matapori in 1895, Edith would have been 2 years old, Jim less than 1, and Edith Clark's daughter Nellie about 1. 2 years later, when Edith Clark died after giving birth to Arthur Ernest Clark, the children were Edith 4, Jim almost 3, Thomas 1 and Nellie 3. As mentioned previously, the partnership was dissolved at the time, with a good deal of acrimony. The following notes are provided by Edith Cooper, which gives a graphic picture of life at Matapori. When the partnership with Clark ended, my father was granted possession of the north end of the property, which extended over the hills to Woolies. There near the beach, which was then used as part of the highway, he erected a 4-roomed cottage and large shed. He then employed men to help cut up suitable timber into railway sleepers and fencing posts, mostly from puriri trees. When this timber was worked out about the middle of the year 1900, my father decided to sell that property and arranged to buy a larger section back in the heavy bush about 3 miles away, where there were kauri and totara trees, suitable for large construction work. Tramway and telephone poles were needed in Auckland at that time. The Woolies Bay property was then sold to the Clements brothers from Coromandel. Some of their descendants are still on the place. They also bought Clark's land about the same time and proved to be good neighbors. My father was able to get permanent access through this property to his new section. There a house and other buildings were put up to accommodate the family and workers. A team of bullocks and more equipment was then needed to make it possible to handle the heavy timber. No shortage of labor in those days, and men were prepared to go into the back country, miles away from shops or hotels, and work from daylight to dark most days of the year. They had Saturday afternoon and Sundays off. Some went to their homes, some went hunting, others rested and read books or played cards. At times they had to do some washing, which was done in tins or buckets at the side of the creek. From £2 10 to £3 a week was a good wage in those days. Trees were felled with cross-cut saws and axes, cut into lengths for handling, then drawn out by bullocks after being trimmed, then taken to the pit saw or placed on a long sledge called a cat, which was made to convey them to the waterway. This was as far as this tidal river was usable. There they stayed until enough were collected, tied together in the water and floated down to the sea and ships. I think the pit saw timber was somehow loaded onto the scows, which had flat bottoms, to come part ways up the river and lay on the hard sand at low tide. All the timber was floated down the narrow waterway at the time of spring tides, when the water would be at its highest level. This could happen early in the morning or late at night. The men, my father with them, would stand on the logs, which were chained together, using long poles to keep them from striking the bank on either side. Not a nice or easy task, especially in cold winter weather. The scows were loaded, and when ready to sail, floated off to the open sea on the way to Auckland. Getting timber to the waterway could be a long story. A roadway had to be formed to take the long sledge or cat as we knew it, and its heavy load. Skids, which were lengths of small logs, were placed across the road about 6 feet apart to keep the heavy load from the sinking into the ground. The poor bullocks had to step over these while pulling the load, and often pools of mud, as the ground was so soft in the winter. We kids were not allowed to go near where the work was going on, so saw little of it. We knew that the very large kauri logs, after being cut to certain lengths, were blasted through the middle with dynamite. Some had to be lowered down steep places with wire rope and chains. A lot of the work was dangerous, but I knew of only one fatal accident. This was presumably that of Charles Ferguson on September 15, 1905. My father seemed to be really lucky. After about 3 years, the worthwhile timber was worked out and another move was made. Dad heard of a small sawmill at Ratangata, which he took over for about 18 months. He took over there some bullocks and horses, necessary equipment, as well as the family. The back place, as we later called it, was left in the care of a family who wanted the use of the house and outbuildings. They kept an eye on the stock. We mostly run cattle. The property had been ring-fenced and a large part cleared and grassed according to government regulations. We all enjoyed the change away from the bush. A fairly good roomy house was rented. The first one we kids had ever lived in, which had a bathroom. It contained a tin bath with a cold water tap. If hot water was needed, it had to be heated on the kitchen stove or in the closed copper outside. Not many conveniences in those days in the country districts. The bathroom also contained a cupboard with a shelf and some drawers, which had evidently been used to contain the necessary equipment to operate a small post office. There was no telephone nearer than Como, several miles away. This move was rather hard on our mother, who was not in good health and had a young baby, presumable Ernest Troy, born October 6, 1903. She baked bread, cooked meat and other things to send to the men camped at the mill, as well as feeding and looking after her family, which included the addition of other 20-year-old brother Charles, who had come to live with us and work at the mill. Sometimes she had help. I was only 10, but I was able to do light work, help mind the little ones and milk the cow, which we were allowed to graze on the property. Sometimes the cow got into the orchard where garlic was growing, and that made the milk taste awful, and had to be thrown out onto the garden. The sawn timber from the mill was taken on a horse-drawn sled to Whangarei, a few miles away, to be sold. Another industry was kauri gum, which would have been in the ground for years after the big trees had dried and rotted away. Some gum diggers were there, mostly single Dalmatian men who lived in huts among the hills where the gum was to be found. They pushed a spear into the ground, and when they hit something hard they guessed it was a piece of gum and dug it out. Some pieces could be as large as a football. Some of the settlers dug for the gum too. They washed and dried it, then on wet days they sat and scrapped it ready for sale. Some of it was quite beautiful to look at when it was smoothed and polished. The settlers there were friendly people, mostly quite well educated. We enjoyed visiting them and they in turn visited us. My mother took part when she could attend the social events held in the evening at the local hall. There would be dancing, musical items and a nice supper to finish up with. Mother would play the piano for some of the dances and accompany her brother when he sang. He had a fine bass voice for a man so young and all of us enjoyed hearing him sing. Soon the time came for us to return to Matapri, but not to the back place, as my father had bought from the Galbraith brothers their nice property beside the sea in Matapri Bay. 2 good cowrie houses were on the place, also a large barn with a loft. The larger house was to be our new home. We lived there for 7 years and then returned to Auckland in 1912. We were very sorry to part from our good route and Gata friends and schoolmates, as we knew it would be a long while before we could see any of them again. Long-distance travel and transport was so difficult in the absence of reasonable roads. On our way back to Matapri we made a short detour through Whangarei where we caught the passenger ship to Auckland where my father's fine old mother Leila, nearing the end of her long life of service to her family and neighbors far and near. While we were still in Auckland my grandmother died. Alice Aspden died July 9, 1905, aged 75 years. After her funeral we went our way to Matapri by ship, I think. But just now, I can't remember much about the trip. Of course we children were delighted to be back so near to our lovely beach again. No holiday houses there then, so the beach was all ours during the time we lived there. Our father gave up the bush work about that time and turned mostly to farming. There was plenty of work to do on both places. More fencing to be done, land to clear, stock to bought and some sold. Our house needed to be enlarged and more conveniences provided. This work was done with my father's help by a friend who was a builder, and who also owned some land and stock several miles away. He did a good job and we were very proud of our nice new home. We had a bathroom at last, and not with a tin bath, but the water still had to be heated and the wash house copper. The building timber was good cowrie and I have been told recently that the old house is at present being renovated, so it is likely that it will be there for a good many years yet. My parents liked company and as the road improved we had more and more visitors. Business people came from Whangarei who could afford to keep horses and a vehicle. They could come in the summer more easily. Some of our relatives from Auckland managed to get there somehow, either by coastal steamer or overland via Whangarei. About everything we needed came from Auckland by the little steamer which called at various bays and harbors each month, weather permitting. Sometimes it could be 6 weeks, but people usually stored enough to see them over the period. Fresh beef was supplied in a district and some cases of tinned meat came with the groceries, etc. Bread was all homemade. We ate certain birds which the men shot in the bush or swamps. No fruit to speak of, but dried fruit, which came with the groceries, was cheap then. Raisins, 4 pence per pound wholesale. Dried apples were quite good for pies, etc. as well. A special tin of lollies usually made its way to us also. Family events of importance which occurred at or before Matapri were the birth of William Henry Aspden in Auckland in 1892. Who later died aged nearly 3 weeks, the birth of Edith Margaret Aspden at Rotorua on May 3, 1893, and the birth of James Archibald Aspden at Auckland on August 30, 1894. Thomas Alfred Aspden was born on July 10, 1896 at Matapri, but was drowned there 15 months later on October 24, 1897, only 2 months after the death of Edith Clark. Then Matapri saw the births of William Ewart Aspden on May 24, 1898, Charles Ivan Cecil Aspden on June 9, 1900, Herbert Stanley Aspden on February 6, 1902, Ernest Roy Aspden on October 6, 1903, and finally at Mattabury, Albert Edward Aspden, born November 9, 1908. Their youngest son Alexander Clifford Aspden was born in Whangarei on March 3, 1910. With a growing family, the question of schooling was important. Edith Cooper tells me that the school was built in 1899 and the first teacher was a Miss Humbly. Parents were obliged to provide board free of charge for her, in turns, while the education board paid her salary and supplied desks and slates and other necessities. The school was built by the settlers and was little more than a shed with a fireplace and a tin chimney. There was a tap outside where one could wash our hands and feet as necessary. First pupils included Vera and Henry Woolley, George Goldsborough, Fred and Vera Galbraith, and Edith Aspden. Some further information about schooling in Mattabury is given by Mrs. Morrison in her book Mattabury, Then and Now. The arrival of the Clemens family in 1900 helped swell the numbers at the school. In 1910 a newly graduated teacher arrived to take charge of his first school, one Hubert Cooper, who was to later marry Edith Aspden, 5 years later on January 14, 1915. He stayed for 2.5 years until the Aspden family left the area. The Aspden family departure so depleted the school roll that the school had to close temporarily. The farm was sold to Mr. J. Morrison on May 25, 1912, and the family packed up and left in June 1912, arriving in Auckland on June 22. They rented a house in Mount Albert for a while before moving into a house that had been built for them in Woodward Road. While they were there, Tom Aspden purchased their first car on November 20, 1914. He obviously loved cars and driving, and at some stage apparently worked at Russell's garage providing a sort of taxi service. Catherine noted that he got his certificate for driving on January 17, 1916. They bought a farm at Manuriwa in May 1916 and moved there from Mount Albert on June 19, 1916. They also appeared to own other properties around Auckland at this time, and subsequently, renting houses to Kershaws and Paddens. The family did not stay long in Manuriwa. They bought a farm from Mr. H. Woods at Rimrama and moved there on September 14, 1917. This too proved only to be a short stay, since they sold that farm less than a year later, and moved to Northcote, where they arrived on September 27, 1918. This was their last move, apart from Catherine's move from the Oaks to her own Queen Street flat. Although Tom continued to look at and consider buying other farms and properties. However, this relentlessness apparently diminished as he had become absorbed by the shipping enterprise, which started with the purchase of the scow Scott. She was a 26-ton ketch-rigged hold scow which proved a faithful workhorse for Tom Aspden and later, the Aspden Shipping Company. And this was despite various strandings. One in Whakatarni, May 7, 1923 is listed in the Index of New Zealand ships, being sunk following a collision in the Auckland harbour with the ferry Albatross, on August 5, 1925, report and photograph appearing in the New Zealand Herald on August 6, 1928, and a fire in the engine room, New Zealand Herald March 24, 1928. Tom appeared to keep a close watch on the operation of the scows. He did not apparently approve of frivolities like weddings getting in the way of scow schedules, and consequently threatened to sack the crew of the Scott when they attended Bill and Gladys' wedding on Tuesday, December 18, 1923, according to a note in the diary, instead of sailing with the scow as soon as she was ready to sail. I don't intend to give any further detailed accounts of the Aspden Shipping Company. Others more knowledgeable than I can do that. However, a brief summary of its 40 years of operations is given in 2 articles which appeared in the Auckland Star of August 2nd and 9th, 1966. In addition to the scows, the family also owned some yachts at various times. The Ida was bought on February 15, 1919 and sold on April 11, 1922. The Heartsease was bought later that year, in September 1922, and was enthusiastically raced and used for cruising. She was apparently sold around 1924-25. Tom was also involved for many years with the Northcote and Birkenhead Yacht Club, being a vice president part of this time. At their annual regatta, normally in March, he, and later the shipping company, would make available a scow to act as flagship. Tom was interested in the Northcote borough as well, being elected councillor in 1919 and serving until 1922. He was later followed in this interest by Bill, who was also to serve as deputy mayor from 1941 to 1944. While life at Northcote was a good deal easier than it had been at Mattabury, and Catherine obviously gained a good deal of pleasure from having her family around her, there were some sad occurrences as well. The most bitter loss was the death of Ernie on July 15, 1925, New Zealand Herald of July 16 and 17, 1925. Catherine rarely let her feelings show, particularly on occasions such as this, but it was nearly a year before she would again write in the family diary again, although Tom would continue to use it. Edith Cooper remembers her father as a quietly spoken man, though always sociable. He did not talk much and never about the past with its hard times and sorrows. He was a hard worker and was up in Birkenhead working at laying paths and gardening at a house they owned there, only a few weeks before he died on January 23, 1936. Tom had been a keen member of the Masonic Order, La Joie, and was given a Masonic funeral. Catherine did not stay long in the Oaks after that, but moved to the front flat at 75 Queen Street, Northcote, that had been under construction before Tom died. The Oaks was not sold until August 18, 1939. She had a constant stream of visitors, the family from Caddy for work reasons, training or just to visit, Marge and Clifford up from Motoro Hunger, babysitting while Renee and Gladys went shopping in town. She kept a detailed record of the comings and goings of the Aspden shipping company boats. Her anxiety for the safety of her boys was often obvious in her diary entries. I have not seen her 1936 diary, but no doubt she suffered great worries when the Kai'ai foundered in the Bay of Plenty on March 25, 1936. She loved and lived for her family, and she was greatly mourned when she died on July 2, 1946.